Welcome, folks, to a special Noble Ape recording on the 13th of June, or June 13th, depending on what part of the world you are. 15 years ago, a fellow in Canberra, Australia, came up with this pretty ridiculous idea of doing a simulation associated with philosophical ideas, and in part of memorialising these 15 years, I've decided to go back and find people that were part of the original discussion, drag them 15 years into the present and see what they have to say associated with this thing called Noble Ape. And the first guinea pig, the first canary down the mine shaft, is none other than Bo Daley. Hello, Bo.
Hi, Tom. It's certainly been a while since we last spoke, hasn't it?
It has. It's been an extraordinarily long time. And you influenced a number of elements of the Noble Ape development. You feature in the original manuals of Noble Ape that have just been re-released at a much cheaper rate and ebook version. Folks are interested in seeing Bo's writing around mid-October, I think, 1996. But you also had influences on the musical elements of Noble Ape, and I guess just the broader philosophy. Do you remember how we first met?
I have this recollection that at the time I was hosting a radio show on a local community radio station, and you got in touch and we did a little feature. We probably spoke for about an hour, and we talked about a whole lot of concepts that I hadn't really thought about a lot before. Some of them were philosophical, some of them were really computational. I remember being introduced to the notion of polymorphic objects for the first time during that conversation. So I think that's probably where we started actually having conversations about artificial life in general and what consciousness might mean from a philosophical perspective, and whether it's possible to model consciousness computationally. I think we had quite a few conversations along those lines. We didn't necessarily always agree with each other, did we?
No, in fact, it's interesting because when I think of Canberra, and I still have family members in Canberra, there is a kind of continuous incest element. And I seem to recall, I don't actually remember how we first met. I remember the radio show, it's certain elements, but I understand also that our parents were part of the same babysitting club. So we may have had some early childhood meetings. In fact, I'm trying to track down James Murata as well. And James, have you heard from James?
There's someone else. No, yeah. So there's another name I haven't heard for a while. So I guess I probably know him mostly from high school, where we went to the same high school in year 11 and 12, and we ended up in the same philosophy class at the Australian National University, and we were studying Kant and Hegel and Heidegger and people like that. And I think at the time James was quite taken with Heidegger and the work of the phenomenologists in general. And since then I have absolutely no idea what's happened to him.
Yeah, he ended up at Oxford. He was at Oxford for a number of years, and I'm trying to track him down currently. He doesn't appear to still be at Oxford. He kind of left a rather curious note up on his personal website, and I guess I could probably track him down via Facebook or one of these many sources, but I have emailed him to ask him to be involved with these very recordings to celebrate 15 years. My recollection is, my recollection of the time in Australia isn't particularly good, but I seem to recall that Graham Wilson also had some kind of connection, or maybe brought us back together. I can't recall how all that fitted together, but I think the early stages of the Noble Ape development were very much about having the kind of discussions that we had associated not only with the nature of the mind and the simulatable nature of the mind, but also various kind of social philosophy elements associated with simulation. And certainly Noble Ape has gone through so many different ebbs and twists with these kind of things, but it still seems to be a point where people that have some interest in these ideas can kind of perturb the simulation in various directions and see what comes out.
Yeah, one of the interesting features I just sort of discovered, I mean, obviously I sort of periodically check out the latest binary of Noble Ape, and one of those instances was yesterday after I received your email. And yeah, so one of the interesting features, which I'm not sure whether I would have had any influence on at all, but this idea of internal and external time perception. And I actually do recall having a conversation with you about that, about the sort of the differences between sort of objective time and subjective time, and that seems to be represented quite nicely in the current version.
Yeah, certainly in the documentation. I mean, I think the Noble Ape philosophic document is really circa 1997. And I have maintained that very... So, yes, you've picked up very much of the kind of time that you were heavily involved, I guess, in the discussion. It's funny because now... I mean, the kind of things that we talk about now associated with Noble Ape is this notion of almost kind of deconstructing elements of Dawkins' memetics, but really more about the idea of... well, for example, we have this fellow called Bob Mottram in the UK who has modelled a wide variety of different phenomena through Noble Ape. And one of the things that he's done recently is looked at the notion of the propagation of ideas rather than being about almost like genetic information, more being about virus-like information. And the notions of social graphing and interplay, which really you were also... I mean, this is your section in the original manuals dealing with the notion of... kind of social norms and how to actually simulate that in this dynamic. But returning to the idea of internal and external, this is very much a kind of ongoing theme in the simulation. It's one of the elements... I think probably Noble Ape Philosophic is still a pretty good document because everything, including moving towards this notion of language, which it does at the end, and the idea that the environment really constructs the societies, there's now considerably more radical regionalism in terms of the apes almost becoming kind of nationalistic in terms of their particular views and the notions of regional languages and all this kind of depth, which really the simulation that you knew, that wasn't a part of. It was more... Noble Ape Philosophic was very much a kind of hopes and dreams document. And I think certainly reflecting in the past 15 years through a variety of ebbs and flows, the simulation has maintained that vision through a variety of different practitioners that have different ideas and different interests. And certainly the use and... I don't know, I wouldn't want to use the term exploitation, but certainly the perturbation that both Apple and Intel have had on the simulation has taken things in different directions as well. But yeah, the philosophically sticky elements, I think, are still there. The notion of internal and external, though, I guess my hope when I started Noble Ape was that a lot of the stuff that has been done in the past 15 years would actually be possible. Part of it was realised through modern computation. And I mean, I'm not sure if you can recall the kind of shared environment or the kind of computers I was writing Noble Ape originally, but
yes.
it was very much associated with the kind of seed ideas and the hope that computation would move in the directions that it had. It was one of the more emotional elements, particularly when Intel picked up the simulation, that they were actually... There was this amazing kind of feedback loop where the computation that I was looking for, Intel was actually developing using the simulation as the kind of testing basis of it.
Really?
And it was quite extraordinary actually meeting some of these engineers about a year ago now, probably June or July last year, and getting the sense of... I mean, it's one thing to be corresponding with folks via email, and certainly they were just like mind-blowingly brilliant. I spoke with a couple of their engineers who had completely deconstructed the cognitive simulation in their own kind of mathematical form and were using it for optimization that I could never really imagine. And it's a strange thing because it really, not like to me now, is more like a child than it is an actual project in terms of it kind of maintaining in some kind of strange ethereal way. So yeah, it is very curious to talk to people who were part of the start and maybe have kind of periodically followed it. So the philosophical underpinnings of Noble Ape were pretty promiscuous, I think. Fair to say. But certainly, yeah, from your perspective and certainly James Murata's perspective, they were certainly two quite different. In fact, I think really my interactions with James Murata were more instigatory than they were kind of philosophically rigorous. It was more just like Noble Ape was kind of like a cattle prod tool to just say, no, wait, actually through relatively empirical means you can actually get quite an interesting simulation coming out of it.
Yes, I'm interested to hear what he thought about it at the time.
Well, the funny thing is that through one of his not his contemporaries, one of the actual academics at Oxford, or one of the more senior academics, is a fellow by the name of Nick Bostrom.
Oh yes, I'm very familiar with his work.
Yeah,
yes,
who's written quite heavily about the notion of simulation, but is actually genuinely ignorant of it. And I think what has interested me through particularly kind of being found or discovered or welcomed into the artificial life community is that there are a number of applied practitioners that really have a lot to say philosophically, if only they can kind of direct their particular angst in that direction. And it did strike me as quite curious that James Murata would end up in the same faculty as Nick Bostrom. Particularly, I did kind of feed James academic articles that I'd published to try and instigate something with Nick Bostrom, but he was probably far too politically savvy to do something like that. I mean,
who knows?
Who knows? But yeah, it is a very, very curious thing. So your own philosophical underpinnings. Let's return to that. What
Sure.
was your particular perspective at the time? Has it changed? And do you think that some aspects of this whole Noble Ape idea may have changed some of your own thinking?
Well, I think at the time I was particularly interested in ideas of sort of social organisation and technologies of social control. So I was particularly interested in ideas coming out of the Foucauldian kind of school, where Foucault was particularly interested in how social technologies actually shaped forms of subjectivity, and I think I've sort of continued on that sort of path, and since then there's been a lot of work in things like obviously network theory and social networks and so forth, which I see as sort of being continuous with those. Sort of Foucauldian strand, and I'm very interested in that. I'm also very interested in ideas. I'm still very interested in ideas of organisation, particularly as they apply to the kind of environments I find myself in these days, which is the sort of the workplace and the corporate office and so forth. You have where you have these quite interesting sort of social dynamics, and then you have attempts to sort of overlay those with these theoretical constructs, which are really quite uncritical, but are very powerful. Things like in the software industry where I work, we have ideas. You're probably familiar with organizational ideas like agile, which is quite an artificial construct, but is enormously powerful. And the other strand that I've been following in the last few years is sort of ecological theory and environmental theory. And so, that's speaking as a sort of an environmentalist. I have quite a strong interest in a lot of the ideas coming out of the environment movement. And one of those is very similar, which is this idea of sort of using ecological spaces as kind of experiments, because ecologies are amazingly complex spaces, and you've got one, for example, in the Noble Ape simulation. There's an amazingly complex ecology going on there, even if it can be computationally modelled. And then you can undertake particular interventions in these ecologies and treat them as sort of as scientific experiments, even when you're trying to produce a particular outcome. And there's a theory there which is quite prevalent in environmental management called adaptive management. And so both of those two strands are sort of part of a kind of a critique of science, really, which is not a critique of science as such, but a critique of normal science, the kind of science which says we have the answers already, and we know that if we just do enough experiments, we'll find out what the truth is. And both of those sort of strands of knowledge suggest that the social spaces and ecological spaces are incredibly complex, that we're probably not going to find the truth at any point. Even if there is some kind of a truth, we probably don't really have access to it. But what we can do is we can interact with it, and we can work out how we affect the environment and how we affect our social surroundings. I think those are the kind of ideas that I'm particularly interested in at the moment.
And that they are all fundamentally ideas that come through Noble Ape as well. I like the idea of from the panopticon to agile. That was just a footnote that I made through your general discussion. I think there's a lot there that could be explored. But this notion of social and environmental space is certainly, I mean, the social aspect. I've been working. Bob developed the initial social interaction kind of metering and event code, and then I created a social graph simulation, which really shows that there is a social space that is independent of the real world space, if that's right, the simulated world space in this case. And what I found particularly fascinating from that is it is very much almost not necessarily, it's a particle physics environment fundamentally. But you can get amazing visualization of social interactions and the ebbs and flows, and the idea that a radical could be ejected from a social group and then kind of pull away various other social followers. The themes of kind of social simulation and also ecological simulation and finding quite abstract interrelationships there's been a long history associated with Noble Ape, and some of the more interesting uses, particularly amongst what was this, people that teach fundamentally. So San Diego State, perhaps, or UC San Diego, did a whole course for, I'm not sure, graduates in education associated with Noble Ape, and they took it in a variety of different directions. I had some correspondence with the primary academic who, as you have done, there were more ideas that they had initially, and then set these possibilities as assignment work to the graduate students, which gave some amazing feedback into... I mean, the thing that still I find fascinating with the simulation is the way people can use it for their own particular interests, quite removed from what it was originally created for. And I think the notion of truth associated with science is certainly something that Noble Ape, as one of many artificial life simulations, has not necessarily worked against, but I think has looked more at science as almost a kind of arts and craft continuous pursuit, or at least has considerably more humour. What you're describing in terms of hard science is more readily described, I guess, as naive science, through folks that are maybe part of the simulation community in particular. But I think what interests me is that certainly in the past 5 years, I've looked more strongly at the ideas in Noble Ape being very applicable to contemporary social theory, particularly how little we actually know about the environments that we interact with, and also how we are generally naive, in large part because we can fool ourselves that we think we understand. And certainly that is an ongoing theme through Noble Ape as well.
So one other thing that sort of comes to mind when you mention that is actually having the ability to understand what is actually going on inside the simulation, because presumably when people are running simulations in the sort of especially in the Nick Bostrom kind of understanding of simulations, people are doing it for a particular purpose, and in order to do that, they probably have to understand what's actually going on inside the simulation.
You see, that's paradox number 16 of Bostrom's many paradoxes, I would say.
Right.
That in fact is so far removed from the truth. I think simulation is more about novelty. I think actually what it is about is throwing down ideas and seeing how little one actually knows, but also then this notion of emergence, which is a central theme in terms of discovering completely curious relationships and really what it shows is that irrespective of whether you know the initial formulae, you won't necessarily know what the formulae will produce when you have thousands of or tens or hundreds of agents doing aspects of this formulae. I think our brains are very well geared to simple interactions, but even taking simple interactions and multiplying it by factors of 100, 200, 1,000, what have you, still creates an amazing amount of unknown. And I think what's emerging through the artificial life community as well is this notion of simulation science, that actually what is coming through all these different kinds of simulations is a new kind of science, which ultimately I don't necessarily want to... my mind's gone completely blank. New kind of science, the fellow's name. Created a search engine recently. Stephen Wolfram. I'm not saying his view specifically. I think there's actually something more interesting, that we can create a new kind of science, a new kind of language, a new kind of philosophy that is motivated, in fact, by vastly complex systems. And computation gives us part of that element, but our ability to actually acknowledge that we know very little when we start this process is a critical part of the discovery, I think.
That maps directly onto the sort of adaptive management discourses that are coming out of ecology and environmental management, where researchers are posed with a particular problem, which is perhaps here's a lake that has effectively died or is in the process of dying, and we can posit some theories about why it's dying. Maybe there's too much agricultural nutrient load coming into the environment or something. But fundamentally, we have no idea what's causing the problem. We don't even know if it is a problem, and we don't know which interventions are going to fix it. So we effectively start with almost no knowledge, and all we can do is interact with the environment and find out how our actions cause reactions in the environment. And that seems to map very, very closely to what you just described about simulation science.
Yes. The interesting thing that comes through all of these the history of simulation, particularly through artificial life, is that the time perturbation element is really critical. It's not a condition necessarily where you start a process and then immediately you have effects that you can see from it. The effects are very much, some are temporal and some are non-temporal, and can occur well after things stop as well, which is one of the really curious things. This also came through Freeman Dyson's comments associated with global warming, and I think what I found fascinating from that was not taking the popular view that Dyson was denying global warming, but in fact probably more the case that these things were far more vicious than we had even predicted, even with the existing state of simulation. In fact, I didn't think that it was a particular direction in Dyson's commentary at all. And what I think is fascinating is that the more you study simulation, the more you understand that naive simulations may move you towards particular results, but it's far more likely as you add more complexity that things could go far worse than has been originally simulated, particularly in the case of our ability to stop something which seems to be just a fast-moving effect.
These climate simulations tend to have very, very simple social models built into them. So the actual prediction of social activity is quite naive in the sense that it simply posits things like we are going to continue to expand our economy at this rate, and that means at this particular rate of carbon emission per unit of economic activity, then we're going to produce this output of carbon. And I think that there's something in your suggestion there that some of those simulations could do with a more sort of complex and possibly a less controllable kind of social element.
Do you want to hear something really scary, Bo?
What's that?
About, let me see now, 5 years ago, and there were 3 different climate scientists that contacted me. Noble Ape has a weather simulation as part of it. It's a relatively simple weather simulation. It's actually to do with an idea of kind of water pressure and effectively a glass ceiling. So the water pressure and the air pressure and the heat kind of moves along, and it's pressurized on top of a very hard atmosphere, which kind of squeezes water out and squeezes thunderstorms out and all this kind of stuff. So 3 separate climate scientists who write these kind of simulations contacted me. I think the last one was about, I want to say 2006, but it first entered the simulation in 2001, and I got an email almost probably a year to the day after it first entered, and so it was kind of spaced evenly over that 3-4 year period. But they all commented that it was an amazing climate model that I had kind of whipped up out of nowhere, in particular, and it made me realise that this is an area of academia that really, as you say, really has a finger in the wind. And I guess that was Dyson's criticism as well. I'm sure that they are far better now.
Well, they are.
But
they are. They're extraordinarily complex in terms of modelling the sort of the biophysical environment. So they have all sorts of understandings based on how carbon reacts in the atmosphere and how it reacts with rocks and so forth to take carbon out of the atmosphere. All these sorts of biophysical modelling is extraordinarily complex. But I think there's a tendency to leave the social dimension to people who are engaged in sort of grassroots activity. So people who go out and actually lobby for better outcomes for the environment and for global warming and so forth. And it's not really part of the remit of the simulators at present.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think, and I use the term junk science very strongly. I think there's some kind of misunderstanding associated with what junk science is versus what pseudoscience is. My definition is very much associated with funding from petroleum and coal interests and basically creating, what appear to be peer-reviewed papers that are in fact flooding aspects of scientific discourse but are completely funded from. The thing that strikes me is that science, and this in large part is also my critique of Dawkins, that when he was nominally the people's scientist, he concentrated almost exclusively on religion and didn't go after any of this, emerging junk science, to the point now, certainly in this country, and this country is relatively unique for a number of factors, but where a majority of the population now questions the kind of scientific information associated with these things. I think the forced politicization of science is something that scientists need to understand in concepts of actually what is occurring in terms of both the influences of junk science, but also, I guess, the nature of kind of funding sources and a wide variety of other curious factors. And it is increasingly interesting that just doing the science, whatever that may mean, is probably not enough for these groups, and the interactions, particularly with grassroots, maybe non-science groups, is something that the other person I'm going to talk to who's actually confirmed so far is Douglas Rushkoff. And Douglas Rushkoff has explored a lot of the kind of right-wing think tanks in this country in terms of their manipulation of language, global warming became climate change, all this kind of stuff, but also how remarkably successful they've been in terms of perturbing the discussion, at least domestically. There needs to be a strong anti-movement that is just as, not necessarily kind of nefariously intelligent, but just as capable of creating a strong contrast, which really seems to be quite lacking in the general discourse. But you're right, there is also a component of this absolute knowledge element, which I think increasingly scientists need to be more honest about.
I think that increasingly scientists are honest about the limits of knowledge and even start questioning ideas like truth, which were kind of sacrosanct for a long time. And even though things like simulations could be used as sort of tools to as part of the almost a sort of a triumph of sort of ideas of logical positivism and so forth. Really, if that sort of honesty about truth is part of it, then really it opens up a whole lot of complexity and opens up the idea that we don't really know exactly what's going on, and but we have confidence that if we take particular actions, we can make things better. And that's really what a lot of those people running climate simulations are doing. They're saying we have a certain degree of uncertainty in our model, but it's pretty clear that we have to take some action. It's probably a good idea to not focus on the uncertainty and to focus on the kind of outcomes which we need.
It is interesting, the idea that simulation forms some kind of modern backbone to logical positivism. It's interesting also because I'm rarely asked, I write about, but I'm rarely asked explicitly associated with what this Noble Ape thing has done to my worldview. I now feel very firmly that I am a monkey in a simulation, and the only thing I can get out of that environment is exactly what we're doing currently. Kind of an international communication is the only way that I can break out of the simulation in any meaningful sense. In fact, really, all that has come through Noble Ape in terms of my own philosophy, aside from a kind of brutal computational nihilism, which may have something to do with the past 15, 16 years of my own experience, is this notion that the way we can break out of these things is through not necessarily a radical communication, but at least an honest communication which can transcend all these elements. I was interviewed a couple of years ago associated with post-singular nihilism, which I seem to be attached to on some level. And the point that I made is exactly this point, that if you take everything as governed so far, the element that we have, the last element that we have of our own humanity is actually this kind of communication. And I think looking at simulation as an element of logical positivism. That's going to take me more than a couple of days to compress, I think. We may have to resume this conversation based on that, because I think I'm going to have to compress that one a little bit more. I guess it's interesting because in terms of my own changes, in terms of my physical locational changes over the past 16 odd years, of which Noble Ape is quite instrumental in some of those experiences, but also the sense of kind of constant rebirth, reawakening, and moving has been a large part of my experience associated with the Noble Ape simulation. And it's interesting talking to you, and I guess hopefully others who have obviously had life experiences kind of going on, but perhaps not as necessarily reconstructing life experience. There've been various points where I'm.
This is becoming like a simulation itself. If only I had constructed my life in such a way that I wasn't writing software all the time, what would have happened?
Yeah, I think this is the elements of writing, I think, that I'm getting out of this. And ironically, writing is very much dying in front of me. And this is another interesting point with Doug Rushkoff, because he's now embraced very much a kind of self-publishing model, which I, in my non-academic writing, have embraced as well, just as means of actually getting it out there. But, it is curious. It is curious that the nature of software engineering and, basic writing software has changed so dramatically in the past 16 years as well, in terms of it moving almost to a kind of blue-collar, a completely outsourced profession in a number of areas. And I think the initial idealism, and it's funny because I don't know much about Bob Mottram's circumstances, but I do get the sense that he's a fellow idealist associated with the nature of code. In fact, a lot of the people that have picked up the software, the actual development of Noble Ape, have been people that are very much kind of code idealists as well. So it is a curious thing in and of itself. But I think the stuff that you were describing, particularly associated with the broader hopes and logical positivism, I think it's a track which I haven't heard for probably 12 years. I think that's quite revitalising. We'll need to redo this after I've actually had some time to decompress that notion.
Right, and I'll try and think of what I actually meant. It was more of a throwaway comment, really.
Which is just completely kind of decompressing my mental states with me currently. Very interesting. Well, I think that was the nature of our initial discussion as well, the stuff that I got out of it. Nick Gaffney is another fellow that I want to track down. I've had some correspondence with him periodically, and he was very heavily involved with the time that I was in Berlin with him was a kind of turning point in a variety of different directions. He similarly, I would have these conversations with, and then what he considered the throwaway line was actually the thing that impacted me the most, and I kind of went off and scribbled in that particular direction. I mean, coming to a kind of 15-year milestone, which in and of itself seems rather perverse, I think you were probably at the laser show at the Shed for the kind of 2-year anniversary, I seem to recall, something like that. Maybe not, actually. I can't remember if you were actually photographed at that event or not. I remember a number of folk, including Nick Gaffney, coming from Adelaide for that particular event.
I'm not sure, but is that the same laser that some years later your mother tried to give me?
Yes. Yeah,
it is.
It's the Eagle laser. It's the defence contracting internal multi-page per second printing laser that actually nearly blinded me at the event as well, because it was far beyond the wattage.
Your mother was quite concerned about turfing it out into landfill because she didn't want it falling into the wrong hands.
Yeah, if Al Qaeda had gotten that laser, it would have fundamentally changed the nature of human history, I'm sure. Similarly, I think if you'd gotten that laser, it probably would as well. I do remember that period because I kind of got it in remote piecemeal updates. You ended up with a Roland organ, though, didn't you, I think?
Oh, yes. I just saw that again today. That's that sort of comes out periodically. It's not currently in the studio, but it's it sort of comes out occasionally, and it makes sounds. It's quite a unique sort of analog piano sound.
It is. It has reeds inside it. It has electric reeds, which is how it actually gets its sound, I think.
Really?
So, yeah.
Okay. See, that's what I really need to do to it, one day when I have time, I'll have to open it up and actually find out what's going on inside it. Because, I mean, like all sort of old analog gear from that era, it's sort of almost infinitely tweakable. So you can open it up and put in a bit more control here and there, and get some, and actually expand the range of what it can do.
Yeah, my uncle has one that is, I think, about 3 generations earlier. That's actually an upright standing. It has like full legs and what have you. And he's taken it apart, and he said that once you've taken it apart and actually cleaned it out and done whatever you need to do to the reeds and what have you, if you're particularly careful, it will play a lot better. And because he actually has recollections of what they sounded like originally, his, which I had the opportunity to play when I was in South Australia maybe a couple of years ago now, it sounds very different. The effect of oxidisation on the reeds actually changes the sound quite a bit. But okay, so we've kind of touched on the trials and tribulations of the past 12 years of Barbelay. In terms of the trials and tribulations of the past 12 years of Daley, what can you add to this? I mean, you're still making music, it sounds like.
Yes. Not a whole lot has changed in the musical sense. I think about 12 years ago I was working with a group called Dark Network, which is a project that is sort of ongoing as well. And it's probably well and truly past its 15-year anniversary by now. Although that went sort of unmarked by a memorial podcast. So that project keeps going. We periodically do things like about a year ago we put out a record, and that was another similar to your sort of self-publishing idea. We decided to start our own record label and release it on our website and via a couple of distributors in Europe. And I think it's just about time to get the second one out in that series, which is what I'm kind of in the studio working on today. And in addition to that, I've got another little project with Kate Crawford, who you might remember.
She passed on your email address, in fact. That's how we are actually communicating, because Kate is on Facebook, so I knew if I contacted her, it would be, just a matter of her passing on your email address.
Yes, well, so we have another little project going called Clone, which has almost as long a lifespan as Dark Network, and we operate out of this little studio in just in the sort of the low rent district of the Sydney city. And it's interesting that you mentioned Facebook there, because I did at one point, toy with the idea of joining Facebook, but I didn't. I just couldn't handle the idea of being contacted by people from primary school, and maybe this is a good opportunity to say hello to everyone from primary school. But
I have a wide reach with my audio recordings, Bo.
But
Facebook.
Of course, I can't really escape it, can I? Because I'm really only just 1 point away from being on Facebook, as you've just discovered.
Well, I knew Kate would be probably the best possible source. There were other possible sources, but Kate seemed to maintain a connection. Yeah, the thing that I did do some recording when I was in the Bay Area, and I do have an emu here, which I plug in and periodically kind of compose on and do various things with. But yeah, the musical aspect of Noble Ape has really suffered, I think, in large part due to the constant movement for a few years. But also, I guess, music is now much more a kind of intimate thing. Although, having said that, I do record jingles for podcasts and various other things, thematic music and these kind of things. And I have done some kind of more long-term composition that I should actually start considering releasing. But in the face of all the other media that I put out after hours, the musical aspects of Noble Ape. In fact, I went back. There were 2 CDs that came out associated with the development. One which you had, I think, a track on, maybe even 2 tracks, and the other which was just a little EP that I put out in '99. But yeah, that is one thing that has really been lacking in the Noble Ape development. I went back, and it had probably been about 3 or 4 years since I'd listened to any of that, and listened to some of that recently. And it really does capture a time where, the dream originally, prior to the Rushkov article, was to come back to Canberra and actually spend 6 months, because I'd saved up enough money to actually spend 6 months doing nothing but recording. And then the Rushkov article came out, and, I ended up in Bay Area. But that's certainly something that's been missing out in the Noble Ape development over many years, is actually the kind of strong musical parallel, which was very much the defining element of the original development. It really almost anthemic in terms of the ability to kind of continue the development. And I guess there was so much unknown in terms of, would this thing actually be something that a group would be receptive to, and almost elements of self-doubt that I think the music part kind of bridged in the early development. Pretty well after the Rushkov article, I was just kind of burnt out from that fear, and really just trying to make sense out of stuff myself. But yeah, it is interesting. I have followed your collaboration with Kate Crawford periodically, and I think certainly Kate had a period where even when I reached the UK, I think she had various music videos and other offerings that were easily accessible.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that you're the kind of self-publishing music, because certainly CD production here is phenomenally cheap. I pressed a series of Biota podcasts about 2 years ago, and I think I was paying, I can't remember, it was something like 35 cents a CD for the final press.
It's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I really think that the CD is it has to be that cheap because it's really a throwaway format now.
Certainly.
It's more or less going straight. It's one of those formats that comes straight out of the production plant, goes into someone's iMac, gets ripped into iTunes, and is then on its way to landfill. It's one of the fastest transitions from production to destruction of pretty much any media form that we have now.
Yeah, the last CD that I produced, I insisted that people actually pass it on to random people once they had done exactly what you described. Because
yes.
the whole nature of it, if it goes straight into landfill, and this was a free CD, this was a CD that was given out at conferences and what have you, but if it goes straight into landfill, and really in large part it was just to get people onto a large archive of online audio recordings. But yeah, the movement straight to landfill, and I guess the digital download paradigm as it is now is something which I think is very curious. I mean, the theme of the past 15 years has been not making any money out of Noble Ape, particularly after my Bay Area experience. Like, literally, it's beyond philosophy. It really is habitualized or ritualized in some fundamental form. The only thing that isn't that way is the original manuals, which I actually really do like in a paper form, although there's an electronic version of it as well. And I kind of moved very heavily to that when I actually started seeing it in a paper form, that it was very much, and that is now, I don't know, $7 or something. So in the price for university college student, ideally. The ability to actually make survival money from your art is something that, I don't know, it's not something that I've ever really considered seriously, because it's not ever been, a possibility. But there was a period there, particularly with some of the slightly more mainstreamized Clan Analog elements, because obviously Dark Network was part of Clan Analog.
Right.
And I still get periodic correspondence from the Clan Analog alumnus, John Draper, a.k.a. Captain Crunch, who had a single Clan Analog track. So, yes, another name from the past. But do you get a sense of, when they were starting, did they have a deal with Sony or something? I seem to recall there was some insanity in the late 90s associated with that.
I don't think it was ever Sony, but Kate's band Biff Tech did have a deal with Sony at one point. But let's see. So there was a succession of record labels or sort of distributors that gave Clan Analog money for various different things. There was sort of Mushroom, which is an Australian company that no longer exists.
When did Mushroom die?
I'm not sure. It was maybe sometime in the last 5 or 6 years. They had this gigantic concert in Melbourne with all of their pop stars that they've produced over the years as a farewell to Mushroom. So then, subsequent to that, I think there was Festival was probably the largest company that was distributing Clan Analog stuff. After that, it was sort of there were smaller distributors like Creative Vibes, which is a sort of an interesting Sydney company, and now I'm actually not sure who's distributing it at all right now.
Right.
But yes, so it's been through a sort of succession of record labels that were, if not directly commercial record labels, then something like commercial record labels. And but then even in that scenario, as pretty much anyone who's worked with a major record label will tell you, it's not a business that you get into to make the money, unless you're one of the 5 or 6 people who does make money.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Mushroom lineup here, actually. And a few of those people, well, at least for a short period of time, made some money.
Yeah, you're right. So they must have. I think there's even people as illustrious as Kylie Minogue would have started on Mushroom.
And her sister, and Jason Donovan, and a wide variety of others. Yeah, I even own some of the earlier Mushroom offerings, but they're considerably more eclectic than this list of people that Wikipedia's put in front of me.
Yes.
Quite disturbing, in fact. So, yeah, I guess the things that occurred in Adelaide and caused the fracturing of a lot of the people that I think we were both involved with in Adelaide. Well, we've mentioned Nick Gaffney, but there were a few other folk in that part of the world. But anyway, there were a wide variety of folk that moved internationally, and many of whom have stayed international. But anyway, Bo, I think this has been I think we should probably conclude the formal discussion at this point.
Yeah.
We needed that down, so we've got some kind of coherent thing there. With the view of 15 years of Noble Ape, in 15 years' time, I'll re-invite you back on for this kind of rambling discussion. Hopefully something more interesting will have occurred. I guess, interesting things have occurred, but in terms of philosophical grit, well, that's one of the interesting things, actually, that has come out of Noble Ape, is that I can write... well, still fringe philosophical papers, but at least philosophical papers that have some strange applied weight, unlike things like Bostrom.
Yes.
And the academic part of Noble Ape, really only in the past 3-4 years, has really taken off. I now have, I think, 3 Springer titles and a 4th one that I'm working on, and various other bits and pieces of the kind of academic publishing side of Noble Ape. A wide variety of elements. The fact that cognitive simulation in particular is something that I'm writing on more, which is quite ironic because it was something that was not even really considered by the academic community up until the point where I started publishing on it. But yeah, the broader philosophy, the broader ideas of what you're talking about in terms of complexity and its use not only in ecology and social aspects, but also questions of consciousness and micro interaction as well as more important macro interaction. It's all stuff that I've actually been able to write on and get published, and in some examples I wrote in a book called Nature Inspired Informatics, which is the example that I use frequently, because it started out with 99 academics and me. This was the initial submission, and then it was 50 academics and me, and then it was 20 academics and me, and it was 12 academics and me, and then it ended up with 9 academics and some schmuck who created this monkey simulation 15 years. And it's like, am I just completely... And these were serious academic institutions that these people were represented at. I do understand that there's a certain amount of novelty in the whole Noble Ape perspective, but it did give me a resounding sense that actually a lot of what I'd felt was not academically palatable could now actually be published. And really that's, in terms of, from your particular perspective, important things that may have happened in the Noble Ape development in the past 15 years, although still relatively fringy, although Springer really isn't that fringy. I have been able to actually start chipping away on the, 3-metre thick outer castle walls of modern academia and trying to...
Of the ivory tower.
Yeah. No, you've got to go through at least 3 layers of castle wall, moats, alligators, dragons, and then you get to the ivory tower. But I'm on the outer castle wall currently with my pick and a great degree of hope. And I think that's probably from your particular perspective, the aspect of Noble Ape where now these ideas are slowly on the fringes being forwarded back into potentially future philosophical academic discussion. Which is interesting, particularly because I'm getting out, in parallel to everything else I'm doing, I'm getting out what I'm calling the biota transcripts, which are a series of podcasts initially that I've now kind of converted into academic paper, kind of dialogue papers, with the view that there are about 40 academic institutions the world over currently teaching artificial life, but doing it very much from a kind of mid to late 80s, early 90s perspective. And the ability actually to have primary conversations with a variety of academics and thinkers in the field, and then get that in text and out, very similar actually to the current form of the original manuals in a book that will sell for $7 to undergraduates, is an amazing way of also propagating these ideas for, I think, probably the more important next generations of thinkers and muses associated with these various fields. You've got to get them while they're young, and preferably when they're in undergraduate studies. And I think that's pretty well the kind of ongoing vision. Very similar.
It sounds like there's a gaping hole in the market for a introductory text in the field.
Well, this is interesting because when I studied physics, there was a book called. Well, the authors were Halliday, Resnick, and Walker, and they had written the first year physics textbook, and they never needed to work again. In fact, one of them flew through the summer months from northern southern hemisphere continuously, trekking the world basically based on the sales associated with this book. And the interesting thing with artificial life as a kind of academic concept is it's now being adopted by a wide variety of disciplines that you wouldn't have previously considered it, had any meaningful interest. So yes, that may actually be the lasting success of this whole Noble Ape thing.
Yes, and you can stop lamenting never making any money out of this.
Yeah, maybe in 15 years' time. But anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure. We'll conclude the formal correspondence at this, the formal discussion at this point, and continue whatever kind of derogatory commentary we want to follow on this thing with. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and yeah, it's probably been at least, I mean, I don't want to say a decade, but it seems like 6 or 7 years since we last had any correspondence.
It must be something like that, yeah. And so thanks for inviting me on. This has been it's been good to revisit some of these ideas, and especially to fire up the simulation again and to see how far it's come.
The funny thing is that there's so much development going in currently. I've got 2 developers pretty well working full-time on Noble Ape. I only do it after hours. But there's so much development going on currently that the version that's on the site is actually drastically out of date. I did check out the version from Subversion, and I had some problems building it on Ubuntu, but I'll fix those. No. It builds. I've built it on 10 and 11, and it should build straight from the script.
Yes, which I think it did, and hence my confusion.
Very good.